Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carl Van Newkirk. I'm the president of the Arlington Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the July program meeting of the Society, which is presented here every month except August, in conjunction with the Arlington County Library. At this time, it's my pleasure to present Annette Benbow. Annette is the president of the Ball Cellars House Committee, a very important function with the Arlington Historical Society, and she will introduce the program for tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl. So thank you all for being here tonight. It's a really wonderful evening for us to be able to tell you the story, not only of the Ball Cellars House, but also of the people who love the house as much as it should be loved for being the oldest building in Arlington County. You will hear tonight from one of the women who accepted the house in 1975 from Marion Sellers, who gave it to us for $1. But I'm not going to steal her thunder. I do want to draw your attention to the table over there. We have a few artifacts that have been uncovered during archaeological digs at the Ball Cellars House. It's just a brief smattering to wet your whistle, because we hope that you come to the Ball Cellars House, where we have many more artifacts on display that we've found on the property over the last 40 years. So I would like to introduce Martha Beggs-Orth. We call her Marty because we love her as much as she loves the house. She, as I said, was one of the team of people, and there are several people in the audience today who worked with her on the house or lived in the house, and who have developed the same love that she has. So Marty, over to you.
We're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Arlington Historical Society having the oldest house in Arlington, and I'm delighted that you all were interested enough in this lovely old house to come out and hear some of the stories about it. If you can't hear it any time, please let me know. It all started with a letter. Don and I, my husband and I, were at home cleaning house on a Saturday morning when the postman dropped a letter through the mail slot, and it was from a lawyer whom we didn't know. And so we quickly opened it, and all these years I remember the opening line. My client, Mrs. Marion Sellers, wishes to give what possibly is the oldest house in Arlington to the Arlington Historical Society. What a line, what an opener. Don immediately called a meeting of the board, and while there was no opposition to accepting it, there were grave doubts presented, and I think rightly so. One, the society was only 19 years old. It didn't have a whole lot of members. It didn't have a whole lot of money. And most importantly, it had another building, a huge building, the old Hume School, which is on South Arlington Ridge Road, which the society still has and is in charge of preserving and maintaining and showing it to the public. And to take on a second building, was a big jump, a big leap. But we took the challenge and accepted this lovely gift and started to work. Don appointed a committee headed by Dean Allard and Ruth Ward. Dean, raise your hand so that people will know who you are. He's here, and we're glad that they accepted this job. They worked 5 years very hard, very diligently, as Connie well knows, and to get the house ready to be shown to the public and to be on its way to being preserved and maintained and shown. Ann Webb wrote the first definitive article about the house in the 1975 journal, which the Society publishes. And a lot of people were participating in helping us. Walter Maycomber, for instance, who worked with Williamsburg, gave us a lot of help and free advice. Matthew Mosca, who's an eminent paint analyst, helped us discover the colors of the houses. And Washington Forest Foundation, which is a local grant foundation, gave us a grant. The Glen Carlin Civic Association was extremely helpful to us. The Service League of Northern Virginia, and 250 individuals gave money to help us get started with preserving and maintaining the house. It was put on the state and national registers. Dr. Dell Upton of Virginia Landmarks Commission in Richmond wrote the nomination for those registers and noted that the most valuable part of the house was the board roof, which is still intact, safe all these years under an outer board roof. I can't find, I've looked and looked, and I cannot find the documentation on this, but somewhere I've read that there are only 12 complete board roofs from the 18th century in our nation, and the Balsellas is one of them that has the complete board roof. The house is really two houses. The original cabin was built about 1750. We know that John Ball took out a patent of land of 166 acres in 1742. And he was a young man starting his family, and it's believed that he built his house certainly in the next few years after this 1742. We decided to, then the addition that is on the house was built in 1880, and the house as it stands today is really two houses joined together, the 1750 cabin and the 1880 Victorian house. It's interesting that the cabin has its original logs underneath the weatherboarding. Now you see here on the side of the house, it looks like a door, but it's really what we call a view window. We cut that through to show you the logs underneath. It's a log cabin covered with clapboard or weatherboarding. And the Victorian house has its original siding. The 18th century part, the old cabin, has its original logs underneath later siding, but the Victorian house has its original siding. And Matthew Mosca found the colors to be cream with the brown and red trim.
This is a close-up of the logged wall that you can see from inside. There's been some work done on it, but basically this is the same logs that John Ball used. Close-up of the log walls.
You see how crudely built it is. That's we are in the National and State Register, noted as crudely built. The cellar is in the cabin is very low, and so when you walk down there, you have to stoop over. And I wonder if that's where my stoop has come from. All these years of going down in that basement, down the stone steps. In the cellar, the stone foundation had to be repaired. Extra support beams were installed. The dirt floor was graded, and a sump pump was put in because of standing water. Carlin Springs is a correct name. There are springs, as Mary Benz knows, all through the neighborhood. And so water does get in basements quite a lot. Every year, we keep our fingers crossed that the giant wisteria vine will bloom. We always think it's going to be dead. It was planted right by the door of the Victorian house, but the arbor for it, which was built by the Garden Club of Virginia for us, is in front of the cabin. That's how big it is. People come and say, well, what kind of tree is that? And we have to say it's not a tree, it's a wisteria vine. While this work was going on throughout the house, I wanted to know particularly about the people who lived there. I didn't know what I could find, but I was amazed at how much I did find and want to share some with you. I used census records, court records, estate records, church records, and town directories. Now, another interesting thing, there are a lot of interesting little bits of information about this, is that the house is on its original site, but the land has changed jurisdictions. When John Ball took out his patent and built his house, he was in Fairfax County. In 1801, Virginia gave some land, along with Maryland, to form the District of Columbia. And so part of the land went to the District of Columbia and part of it stayed in Virginia. The house went to the District of Columbia jurisdiction. So I did research in Fairfax County, I did research in District of Columbia, and then when in 1846, Virginia asked for its land back, and DC gave it back. That would never happen today, but it did in 1846. We got our land back, and so it became Alexandria County, and finally in 1922, it became Arlington County. So this little house sitting on the same land has been in 4 different jurisdictions. Now, I want to tell you about the 8 owners. It's a very simple, humble house, and so I didn't think I'd find very much, to be perfectly honest. I just thought that there wouldn't be that much, but it's amazing what you're able to find. So beware of what that people might find in court records and all sorts of records in the county courthouse. Okay. The first owner was the builder, John Ball. By the way, at the very beginning, we decided to name the house for the first and the last owners. John Ball was the first owner, and the person who owned the house before the Arlington Historical Society, who gave it to the Arlington Historical Society, was Marion Sellers. People come to the Ball Sellers house today all excited. They come running up the path and they say, "Oh, hello, I'm Susie Ball, and I've come to see this house that my 6th great-grandfather built." And my face falls because I have to tell them, if their name is Ball, they can't be the 6th great-granddaughter of John Ball. He didn't have any sons. He had 5 daughters, and so if your name is Ball, it's probably your ancestors, probably from this area, Moses Ball, John's brother, but not our John. We think that 3 of the daughters, the last 3, were born in the house because they were born after he had taken his patent and probably built the house. He was also not only a builder and a farmer, but he was a miller. And I found this record in 2 ways. One, in his estate sale, he had 2 old millstones for sale, but they were an item that didn't sell. And when we got the property in 1975, there were 2 old broken millstones on the property. And you can't prove that those were John Ball's, but it seems reasonable to think that the 2 old broken millstones were the 2 old broken millstones that were in his inventory and in his estate sale. The other thing that didn't sell in the estate sale that I wish we'd gotten or found was the still. He had a still, but we didn't find that. Another thing that we learn about John Ball that is interesting to me, showing him a man of some literature, some culture, some music, is the fact that in his inventory he had a parcel of books and some spectacles to read those books and a fiddle. So he must have loved music. So it enhances your knowledge of John Ball, a miller, a builder. And another thing, in his 166 acres, there's never any mention of any slaves. He never seemed to have owned slaves. So he had to work that land with the help of his family and his neighbors, which was common. They did a lot of neighboring work together. John Ball died in 1766, and the property was sold in 1772 to William Carlin, who was George Washington's tailor. So he has a claim to fame. We don't think George Washington ever came to the Ball Sellers house, but William Carlin went to Mount Vernon. When William Carlin inherited the house in 1772, it became his home for 118 years, through his family's home, through 3 generations. But William Carlin's account book is extant. It is here. It's owned by one of his descendants who lives in a southern state. I can't remember whether it's Georgia or Mississippi. And but some years ago, the Smithsonian had an exhibit of the clothing and fabrics of this day, of when William Carlin would have been a tailor, and they copied the book, and you can read it on microfilm at the Alexandria Library. Some of the notations in it are, for Colonel George Mason, a suit of mourning, coats and breeches for Mason's sons, John Parke Custis, a great coat of silk, a wedding suit for Charles Alexander, 2 pairs of drawers for Mr. Fleming Patterson, altered a pair of stays for the daughter of Mrs. Patterson and was paid for by bushels of potatoes. And for George Washington, he lined a scarlet jacket. During the time that Carlin lived in the house, he bought up land around him, increased his house with additions, so that occasionally the house was called the Mansion House. He had an addition on each end of the cabin. Now, another interesting thing about the tailor, about William Carlin, is that when he died, he directed his executor to employ a surveyor to lay off my land in lots which may be likely to suit purchases of small capital. Does that sound familiar? For some reason, this was not done, and his property was divided among his 3 sons. James Carlin got the share with the house on it. His son George descendants went on to become prominent businessmen in Alexandria, and their name is often mentioned in Alexandria records. And the son Wesley became big in politics. He was a school teacher, and he served on a board with George Washington Parke Custis, and he also was a justice of the peace. Now, these were the 3rd owners. The 3rd owner was James Harvey. He was the son of William Carlin, and he had 4 children who were the 3rd generation to own the house. We don't really know much about James Harvey Carlin. He lived very quietly in the house, did his farming, and we really know very, very little. But his children we know more about. And they would be the 4th owners of the 8 owners. Their names are, you can see their names. The two unmarried ones lived in the house, Anne and Andrew. And John and William, John went into D.C. and owned a grocery store, and it was running, he ran it for years, decades in fact. It was a long-standing business in D.C. And his brother his brother William bought land and farmed like his father James had. But all four of them were entrepreneurs. In 1872, when the Washington and Ohio Railroad put a train stop and station adjacent to their property near the springs on their land, they built a resort in Glencarlin, complete with picnic pavilion, a restaurant, dance hall, swimming hole, ice cream parlor, and even a bar. People from the hot city of Washington would come out on the train and spend the day at this lively place. It was open for about 12 years and was on the Hopkins map of Alexandria County in 1878. These four grandchildren, were the ones who built the addition that stands today. There's the train station that the railroad put up. The east wing.
And this is the 1880s addition that they added to the house.
That's right. And you see the cabin hidden by the wisteria vine on the right. Only in 1887, these four who owned the house, with two living in the house of the grandchildren, in 1887 they sold the property to Sam Burdett and William Curtis, who were law partners. So these fifth owners were lawyers. We've had a miller, we've had a tailor, we've had a farmer, and we've had entrepreneurs, and now we're having lawyers. There was a covenant in the deed for the family cemetery to be well fenced and perfected, and no more burials except for Carla and family members. It is adjacent to the library with a few stones all piled together close to the building. It still is well fenced. You can go in any time, cared for, and believe that there are many burials under the whole expanse, but until an architectural dig is done, we don't know. The last burial was in 1905. I wasn't around then. Mary Ann Carlin, school teacher, the daughter of Wesley Carlin, was buried. Samuel Burdett and William Curtis were also entrepreneurs like the four Carlin grandchildren. Burdett came here in 1869 as a congressman from Missouri, a lawyer, and served in the United States Army. He became commissioner of the General Land Office. He moved to Virginia and built a beautiful home. His law partner, William Curtis of Ohio, came to the area as a correspondent for New York Times. He became the president of the Board of Trustees of the district public school and one of the honor guards at Lincoln's coffin at the Capitol. He married a local girl, Jane Bacchus. Are the Bacchus, is anybody from the Bacchus family here? They live in Glencarlin. These were the men that the land was sold to. They started the first village in the area of Arlington. Glencarlin was the first village that came into being. 13 acres were designated as a park, Glencarlin Park today. They divided the land into 384 small lots sold for $100 apiece to all men and women of moderate means who received stated salaries. You had to have a job to be able to buy a $100 lot. This was the sort of dream that William Carlin had had for his land 68 years before. Now, that dream became a reality. It's an interesting bit of information about Glencarlin. While the men were selling lots and developing the community, they used the old house as a schoolhouse and also as a rental property for people who were building their own homes.
So one of the pictures that I wanted to make sure that you saw, this was a postcard. This was a postcard that I found on eBay. Imagine how excited I was to see a postcard of a ball seller's house on eBay. And on the back, it's signed, and a note is sent to their relatives in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it is signed by someone who says that she lived in the house in 1888. So that would have been when they were renting the house. So here, out of the blue, is we have a first name of Alice, who lived in the house as a renter in 1888. But this picture is very unique. It is one of the oldest we have of the house, and it really illustrates that there were 3 sections of the house. The one furthest away is from the 1880s, the Victorian house, which is where our caretaker currently lives. Then the middle section, you can still make out the shape of the ball seller's house, the original 1742 cabin. And then, as Marty has told us briefly, the part of the house that's closest to us on the east is no longer with us. It's been torn down, but this was an eastern section. So this is a pretty large house as things go, then and now.
A mansion house.
A mansion house, exactly. So we know that this is a true picture because underneath in the root cellar, the picture which you saw, we can tell that the foundation of the eastern part of the house is still there. So there's evidence of that. So if you want to crawl around in the root cellar, you just let us know. We'll be happy to show you the small remnants of what's left of the door from one section into the section that's gone now.
We have 2 people who've lived in the house, not in the 1800s. Here, Margaret Wagner is our current tenant, and Hunt Allard lived here in 1880s.
No.
1980.
85, 86.
Yeah. Anyone else who's lived in the house? Okay. Annette has found some fabulous pictures. Most of these you came from the library?
Some, yep. And I have to credit Margaret Wagner with taking some of the really nice shots of the house. Thank you, Margaret. Here's another section. This is the front side. This is, again, you can see the ball cellars, the original cabin, now on your left, because we're looking at it from the other direction, and then a shot of the east wing that I explained was no more. So this is the other side of the house. Okay.
All right, we're to the 6th owner of the house, was Miss Irene Young, and she was a school teacher. She was described in the deed of purchase as unmarried of D.C. She first appears in D.C. records in 1893 as a clerk in the census office, and then she's listed in 1896 as a teacher. A Washington Post article in 1906 lists all D.C. school teachers, and Miss Irene is listed as teaching at Weston High School. In 1908, she is listed in the D.C. directory at 2210 Pennsylvania Avenue. By 1911, the year she bought the house, she is listed in Glencarlin. Now, she was the first person to buy the house from Samuel Burdett and William Curtis.
This is not her, but we got really excited when we saw that this is the right era for her, but this is not, we do not know that this is a picture of her. One of the reasons why we have this picture, though, is because she would come out on the train, and we fantasize that this is a picture of her waiting for the train.
Waiting for the train. Marion Sellers remembers her family saying that Miss Irene came out to live in the summer and brought her mother with us. And we do hear that a lot of times from Glen Carlin residents, that there were, it used to have a lot of summer homes. People would come out from the hot city, and it was cooler out here in the country. Now, there are two things that we know that Miss Irene did to the house. One, she doubled the property. When she had bought the property from Burdett and Curtis, she bought lots 3 and 4, which had lot 3 has the house on it. Lot 4 has a side yard on it. But lots 1 and 2, which are the corner lots, she didn't buy. But now, during her stay there, during her 11 years that she lived there, she did increase the property by buying lots 1 and 2. So the property became 4 lots. The other thing that she did was she tore down the east addition. Now, we don't know why she tore it down, and maybe the termites had it. It may have been in just such horrible shape that she couldn't use it, but at least she didn't tear down the cabin. So Miss Irene, that's what we know about Miss Irene. Now, the 7th owners were William and Julia Powell, who purchased the property from Miss Irene and lived there until William died in 1969 and left it to his deceased wife's niece, Marion Sellers. William was an Army vet of World War I, and he even tried to enlist in World War II, but he was too old, and they wouldn't take him. He worked they became government workers. We've had school teacher, lawyers, farmer, miller, tailor, but now we've got government workers. He worked at the Navy Yard and Julia at the Commerce Department. They rode the trolley into D.C. every day and came home at night to their garden and chickens. They had no children, but in 1932, Julia's niece, Marion Reinhardt, daughter of Julia's brother, came to live with them when she was orphaned at the age of 9. Here was Marion's home until she married George Sellers in 1943. She died in 1957, and Uncle Will in 1969. Now, Julia is really the interesting character here. Nobody's famous, but I think William Carlin, to a certain extent, was famous, being George Washington's tailor. And Julia Reinhardt Powell is certainly famous, because before she was married, during World War I, she was one of the first 1,000 women allowed into the armed forces of the United States. So this is something to really be proud of for Julia Reinhardt. They were called, these women who were allowed into the armed forces, and by the way, Julia went into the Navy, they were called yeomanettes or yeoman Fs, female, yeoman female. But the interesting thing was that the Navy had a problem, because everybody who was in the Navy had to be assigned to a ship, and they couldn't assign women to a ship and make it co-ed. So they assigned them to tugboats that went up and down the Potomac River. We even have a picture and know the name of the tugboat that Julia was assigned to, the Triton. There it is. We don't know whether she ever stepped foot on it or not, but that was her assignment. When Julia died, William buried her at Arlington Cemetery under his right to be buried there. But Marion and I were not happy with that. We felt that she ought to have something on her tombstone that indicated she was in the armed forces herself. So we went to Arlington Cemetery, and they said they would be glad to give her another stone if we brought her papers to them. So we went down to the archives, and we couldn't find any papers on Marion. So the archives said, well, try St. Louis. That's where the papers go for storage. So they're in St. Louis. So we called St. Louis, and they said, oh, those papers burned. So we didn't have any papers, but we didn't give up. We went to John Warner, remember, who married Elizabeth Taylor? We had the papers the next day. And Arlington Cemetery changed her stone. And so she is buried at Arlington Cemetery under her own right to be buried there. It's interesting that the lots that William and Julia have are right behind the Women's Memorial in Arlington Cemetery. In the first, you can stand there just very close to the Women's Memorial. I believe the Powells are the key to the survival of the house in its pure and intact state. It is a very pure house. It has so much of its original material. They lived there very simply in a time when everyone wanted to modernize, change, install aluminum siding and paneling, or tear down old places. But they stayed on in the house as it was, caring for and protecting it, farming and raising chickens and planting apple trees. We have them to thank for that and for passing on to a generous and wise woman, Marion Reinhardt Sellers, who was its 8th owner. She was the orphan child from Chicago, grew up in the old house. She remembered lying in a hammock under the large wisteria vine, still alive today, about 100 years old. A shower could come up and she said she wouldn't even get wet. She remembered when the house got plumbing and how black the night was with no street lights. In fact, in her late teens, a new boy moved into the house behind the Ball Sellers house on 4th Street, George Sellers. Romance blossomed over the back fence, and they married in 1943. Vienna became their home, where they raised a son and a daughter, and Marion worked at State Farm Insurance, later becoming town clerk for Vienna. When she inherited the old house in 1969 on the 4 lots in Glencarlin, she tried renting it out, but found she didn't like being a landlady. But she knew that if she sold the house, it would be torn down and promptly cleared, developed for multiple houses. She was in a quandary. A co-worker named Lorraine Sternberger, I never met her, but I have blessed her through 40 years, suggested to Marion that she give it to a historical society. So we've come full circle to that letter in 1975. My client, Mrs. Marion Sellers, wishes to give possibly the oldest house in Arlington to the Arlington Historical Society. Marion Reinhardt Sellers had the foresight and the grace to save an important house. Very few of these little buildings that our forebears built are still standing. They burned or rotted, or termites got them, or someone tore them down simply because they were old. Marion Sellers knew she had a treasure, and she saved it by giving it away. Thanks. Sorry for the Kleenex. Do you want to have it? Annette will answer questions.
Oh, yeah. We'll answer them together because you're the one who knows everything. So what I wanted to show you here was through the years, you've seen a couple of these images already, but through the years, the Ball Sellers house has been pictured by artists and commemorated in the community. And the top is a picture that it was painted by the Bacchus family, who lives in Glencarlin. The middle one is a picture that was painted by Rudy Wendelin. Rudy Wendelin was the forestry artist who came up with Smokey Bear, that's correct, and Woodsy Owl. Well, he lived in Bluemont, and he loved the house like we do. So he painted the picture, and you can see a larger, more clear picture in the Ball Sellers house. So those are some of the one on the left, in the middle, the color one, that's actually on the quilt, the 100-year anniversary quilt in the Glen Carlin Library. So the Ball Sellers House has not only been part of the community, it's also the people have appreciated it and wanted to honor it as we do.
I forgot to tell you all that when the house was first painted, Dean Allen and I painted it. We didn't have much money when we started out with this restoration. And they never asked us to paint it again. They've hired people since then.
So we will take questions, and we ask that you wait till the microphone reaches you. Sir, back there. Go ahead, Mark. There we go.
Dave Backus, my mother painted that picture up there.
Oh.
My question is, I've had conversations about where the Ball's mill was located. There is a piece of cement, if you go down on the 3rd Street down into the park, we call it the Pancake Park because every June we have pancake breakfast. That's a plug for pancake breakfast. $5 a piece, good deal. If you go over where the old railroad track was, on the far side, there is cement that crosses the stream. And my supposition from reading different documents is that was where the Ball's original mill was located, but I can't prove it. It's just that there are not too many pieces of cement in the middle of a stream.
Marty, insight?
I can help on that one. One of the reasons that we know John Ball was a miller was that we found a land grant to a man named John Covell, who had land up in what today is Arlington Forest, but north of Glen Carlin. And right on his land plat, right at the bottom of it, which would be the southern part going into what is now Glen Carlin, right over the line, almost on the line, there's a little mark, and it said John Ball's Mill. So if you're a good surveyor, you can look up John Covell, Colville, and look at his land plat and see where it is there. So it is documented where it is, where it was.
I assume the wood was from the land around, and it was hardwood trees. How did it survive the termites, and how did they get the name Glen Carlin with the Y in it?
You want to take the termite one?
I don't know that one. I don't know that. It was considered fashionable, I think, to spell it the English way, Carlin, with the Y. Bacchus may have a.
Go ahead, Mark. Wait for the microphone. Hold on.
Thank you. When Glen Carlin became Glen Carlin, it was spelled Glen Carlin or Carl. Anyways, the post office thought it was a great idea to change it, so they changed it to the Y because they said it looked prettier. But they were trying to stop it from being two words and do it one. And while they were at it, they just threw the Y in there for fun.
Now, how the house stayed termite-free, that's a bit of a miracle. We believe, and correct me, Jane, if I'm wrong, one of my predecessors as chair of the Ball Sellers House is here in the audience, Jane Casey. But I think most of the house was made of chestnut. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound right to you? Okay, so I think I've read that somewhere, that most of the house was chestnut. There is evidence of some termite damage in the 1880s section, but for some reason, the floor of the Ball Sellers House itself is pretty, I don't see it. There was a bit, and we've replaced it, but we've replaced it in a way that you can tell that that's not the original part of the house. But almost the overwhelming majority of the floorboards certainly are still, they're termite free. Grace of God. Yeah, grace of God, absolutely. Tom.
Marty, hi, Tom Dickinson here. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your love and affection for the Ball Cellars House with us tonight, as well as the history, and to thank you and your husband and all of the people back in 1975 who had the courage as members of the Historical Society to take this on and to accept the house, because obviously, like you said, it was a big challenge. And you were a young organization, and it was unknown, you know, what would happen and how you would do all this and so on. So to take that step, I really admire you and your husband and all those other people for doing that, and for, in a way then, bequesting this gift to us that we will always have because of what you were willing to do, the courage that you had back then to do this. So thank you.
Fun trip.
Thank you for doing that.
Here, here.
And just one question, Marty. Do you recall when the house became the property of the Historical Society? What was your biggest challenge? Was it, you know, legally, or was it structurally? I mean, you know, what kinds of things did you have to look at? I mean, as far as like taking the house on and assuming ownership, were there structural problems with it that you had to address? Were there, you know, repairs that you had to make, and so on and so forth?
So naive that none of it seemed impossible, you know. We just, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Since the house has, the old Ball house has no evidence, at least to my eyes, of a kitchen, did you ever find any records about there being an exterior kitchen building? In other words, where did they cook?
They didn't cook in the summertime, or they cooked outside in big kettles. I don't think a house of that sort would have had much of a kitchen outside another building. The big places like Mount Vernon did, you know, but, and this is the thing that's so wonderful about the Ball Cellars. School children get the impression that everybody lived at Mount Vernon. And so they need to see the Ball Cellars house. That's the way most of our forefathers lived. And they cooked over the fire they had a huge fireplace in the main room, in the room that they had, and they would cook there in the winter, but in the summer they just didn't, you know, they would have had a small place, but a small place would be awfully hot again, like the house, you know. The house is too small to cook in the summertime. It just would burn you up, I think.
This gentleman here has had his hand up several times, in the blue in the front.
Thanks very much. Just a little comment first on chestnut wood, which is very commonly used for construction prior to the great chestnut blight, which destroyed the chestnut forest, which extended throughout the eastern part of the United States. It was the major tree prior to the exotic chestnut pest. And believe it or not, there are vestiges in Glen Collin Park, not far from 4 Mile Run. There are a couple of surviving chestnut trees which are able to struggle up to maybe 10 or 15 feet before they succumb to the disease. They were discovered about 15 years ago by Greg Zell, who was a wonderful naturalist for the Parks Division. But I wanted to ask a question, and that is, do we know where the 166 acres of the original land grant, where did they extend to? I'm particularly interested in whether they extended north at all.
I think it was more west. There is a plat in one of the books that really shows pretty much the 100, and it's interesting that Glen Carlin itself today is the same shape. It's a sort of like this shape.
Like a triangle?
Like a triangle, right.
And
But
John Ball's house was sort of on the southern part of the land tract?
no, I think it was more kind of in in the middle, but I'm not sure, I can't say for sure.
I can address that a little bit. In 1976, I believe, the Northern Virginia Sun published a map that was done by Don Wise. It
Oh,
overlaid the original land grants over top of a modern street map. And so that map, or copies of that map, are available for sale at the Historical Museum.
Over to the Historical Society.
And you can look on it and see exactly where the, or as close as Mr. Wise could plot it, where the boundaries of the grant were.
Talking about people who started working on the Ball Sellers House, my husband's Dean Allard, and Dean and Marty were there night and day. But inevitably, Don and I also got hooked into it. And Don Orth, who is the nicest, sweetest, most wonderful person in the world, taught me how to lay the brick for the walk to the front door. And it wasn't easy. And Don kept saying, Connie, come on, you can do it. Connie, come on, you can do it. And finally he said, damn it, you'll never be a bricklayer. And then I remember Dean for years and years had the emergency phone number at night. And they would call us up in the middle of the night, and somebody would say, we would be in a double bed, and I would be answering the phone and hand it to him, and they would say, the plumbing is leaking, the toilet's overflowing, and Dean would say, wait till morning and hang up. Or they'd call it and they'd say, we think somebody's trying to break in the Ball Sellers House. Quick, come over to the Ball Sellers House. And Dean would say, wait till morning.
What happens now, Margaret, when I get a call in the middle of the night? We haven't had to have a call in the middle of the night. Dean, please.
The question is raised of major problems that we thought we had when we took on this bear, and one of the problems was money. We did raise $25,000 in the first, about $25,000 in the first year, which was pretty good for that time. But we also recognized that we had a problem with maintaining, how are we going to maintain the property, as modest as it is? And Walter Maycomber, the architect from Georgetown, who gave us pro bono advice and just marvelous advice, put things on the head. And he said, you know, don't make this and try to make this into a museum building that is that just is available for the public to see on a museum basis. Instead, you have in your one wing there a property that can be rented and can be provided with money and continuing income. And that has been a secret, I think, to the success of the property. So often people would jump into the idea of, let's preserve this some way and elaborate upon it. And with regard to the elaboration, we also had superb advice from our friend in Richmond.
Del Upton.
He gave us superb advice, and he recommended and urged that we not try to speculate on what was going on in that house. What we did do was just rip off the exterior, basically, and leave the shell. And we did try to, I'm afraid, the one mistake I think we might have made was the fireplace, which probably would not have been brick and would have probably been crude stone. But otherwise, the theory was well versed that we needed to preserve it and not to elaborate upon it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just feel compelled to make a few comments. I grew up in Glen Carlin from early teens, and I have extremely happy memories of visiting the Powells, and particularly Mrs. Powell. She was a very outgoing, social person. He seemed more quiet, but then again, perhaps I didn't have the opportunity to know him in social circumstances. But Mrs. Powell did cook in that small, the area there. And I, of course, would step in there and feel like I was making a step back in time. This was in the mid to late 40s. I never met her daughter that I can remember, but she cooked, Mrs. Powell cooked on an old iron wood-fired stove, and many times I'd go in and there she'd be cooking away.
It's a wonder the house didn't burn down.
I know, you're right. But she was an extremely wonderful gardener around that corner of 3rd and Kensington. She had peonies around that entire fence yard in the springtime, and she had a gorgeous pansy garden further inside. But she will always remain in my mind as a wonderful, happy memory.
Well, she was in World War I.
Yes, she was. She was a remarkable
Naval,
person.
Naval Yeoman F.
Yes.
I understand that the front, as in the top there, that was the original front of the house. But after the Burdett and his company subdivided the land, that became what we think of that as the back today. But when it was the front, I presume there was some sort of a driveway or something that went to a road. And which road did it?
It came in from Kensington.
From Kensington?
Uh-huh. That was an orchard. Those 2 lots were mainly orchard, apple trees. And the road came in, when we got the property, we drove in that way. You would drive in, it was a curved road. It was very gravel sort of road, or, rustic road.
What you see, the fence there, that's the beginning of the road, and that's Kensington Street. We're actually looking at where the Stetson house is right now. We're standing on where the Stetson is. That's where this picture's taken. And the road starts with that gate right there.
Thank you.
That's great.